In modern political discourse, arguments and discussions have largely been centered around one word, and that word is democracy. However, most people don't know its true meaning in both the historical context and its philosophical origin. Ironically, those that have been using the term democracy in a positive way have unknowingly been propping up one of the most insidious forms of rule in human history. This might be surprising for some to learn, but given the historical and philosophical truth, we can better understand the power of language, how people can change the meaning of words over time, and how those changes can weaponize ideologies so that they may wield power. The word democracy has been changed to be synonymous with what Aristotle called polity during his time in ancient Greece. Aristotle wrote 8 books on politics, in which the word we use today, politics, comes from Aristotle's use of the word polis, which means the things concerning the polis, which describes the individual communities in ancient Greece during that time, or the city-states, which are the ones he studied. Aristotle was responsible for critiquing 158 separate city-state constitutions in which he analyzed the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. He is responsible for designating 3 varieties of constitution, or the makeup of each government type of rule. It is a chart of 3 different ways each city-state could govern, and 2 different forms each can take as a dialectical view. 1. He notes that if one person rules, the good form is monarchy, or an ideal philosopher king, like Plato describes, which would be an honest, virtuous, and noble ruler who makes decisions with the best interests of the people at heart. However, he also observed that the bad form of a monarch, the flip side, is that one ruler can become a tyrant. The second one, there is rule by a few noble and highly educated people who Aristotle described as an aristocracy in its good form, comprised of several philosopher kings instead of just one, that rule nobly and just with wisdom. However, the bad form he explains, is an oligarchy, where the few rules in their own interests at the expense of the many, which ends up being another form of tyranny. And the third, the answer to the previous bad forms of a dictatorial tyrant and a tyrannical oligarchy, is the rule of the many, and the good form of this is polity and or timocracy. But the bad form, as Aristotle describes, is democracy, in which Aristotle explains is mob rule, or the tyranny of the majority. It is ironic that we use the word democracy today in such high esteem, and we often say it when we really mean republic or representative democracy, if you were to stay true to the definition all the great thinkers of ancient times knew to be true. Often people think it means something positive, but to the great thinkers of the ancient world, it was actually a negative, and it was known to be the bad form of the rule of the many. In the colonies during the United States Revolutionary era, the founding fathers and framers of our Constitution also saw it this way for the most part when they debated and designed the framework for our existing and enduring Constitution thus far. However, it was populists like Thomas Jefferson that would begin to use the word democracy in a favorable light, as Jefferson was staunchly anti-federalist and against the idea of nobility, monarchy, or aristocratic elites, though he was still one of them. He thought himself to represent the farmer and the populace of the rural population against the interests of the more powerful New England establishment and urban elites. Jefferson was also a fan of the French revolutionaries and favored the Jacobins initially against the French monarchy and loyalists. In that era of revolution, anti-monarch sentiment was popular, but at an unintended cost. Though men like Thomas Jefferson were patriots who advocated for liberty and the pursuit of happiness, their embrace of democracy tended to undermine their original intent, as the warning from Aristotle might not have had enough impact with men like Jefferson, that democracy would open the gateways and allow for the tyranny of the majority to take place. On some level, the founders understood this dilemma, and so checks and balances were carefully placed within the United States Constitution to ensure that the bad forms of rule were slowed down or halted altogether, and that the good forms could thrive. Aristotle understood the dangers of a pure democracy, and so did the founding fathers of the United States Constitution. They understood where groupthink and mob mentality would create a tyranny of the majority, and that just because a majority of people want something doesn't always always mean it is right or virtuous or wise, and that justice may not be served to the minority population. Through a historical lens, another example of a tyranny of the majority is the civil rights era in the United States, where in the South, black people were a minority population and white people were a majority population in terms of voting power. The concept is the same just because white people in the South during the time were a clear and overwhelming majority doesn't mean that because they won all the elections that they would create fair and just laws for everyone all the time. It did not make them right or correct or morally superior or ethical. Just because whites outnumbered black people doesn't mean they were allowed to unconstitutionally impose their will and policy onto the black population. Jim Crow laws discriminated against black people in the South, where they had unconstitutional practices and local and state laws, segregating blacks from white-only spaces, and so it was truly, as Aristotle observed, a tyranny of the majority, even though it was democracy in action. That is why Democrats in this current day who preach about democracy and keep repeating talking points like threat to our democracy either don't really understand that democracy by itself isn't always virtuous or a good thing if it is corrupted into its bad form and historical definition, or it is that they really do know the true meaning of democracy and they are of the mindset of a French revolutionary Jacobin and they advocate for an angry populist revolt or some kind of mob rule. The use of the word democracy in both how Jeffersonians used it and in revolutionary America and how revolutionary Jacobins in France and Europe thereafter had changed the way intellectuals and historians used the term from that point onward. This is how a word that was once understood as a negative could mutate into a positive in the public conscience. The concept of democracy would be rebranded as only having upside, ignoring the ancient wisdom that it would inevitably lead to some of the mob rule and tyranny of the majority. In the Civil Rights era, the Supreme Court had to step in when other branches could not and put a stop to a lot of the Jim Crow laws. This is another example of the brilliance of the founders and the system of government they put in place that almost 200 years later, a future dispute was resolved through the system of checks and balances organically, because there isn't one branch of government that is too powerful, and the shared power ensures that tyranny that could arise from any of the three forms of rule that Aristotle observed would be difficult and almost impossible to achieve within the bounds of the Constitution. And if somehow tyranny was obtained by any of the bad forms, whether it be a tyrant or dictator, tyrannical oligarchy, or a mob rule tyrannical majority party, the idea was that it wouldn't last for too long. In the United States, we don't have a democracy. This is why a lot of constitutional scholars that actually know what they're talking about will say that we don't have a democracy, that our country is a constitutional republic, which is technically more accurate than simply saying democracy by itself. When people just simply say that we have a democracy or keep saying our democracy, they are effectively ignoring what makes the Constitution unique and either ignoring that the Constitution was designed with checks and balances specific to Aristotle's observed three systems of rule. The presidency was the founder's version of Aristotle's good form of a monarch, or what he described as a philosopher king, and this idea would evolve and be known as Madison's ideal unitary executive. Only they would be elected to a limited term. The Senate and judicial branch were to be the founder's version of what Aristotle describes as the nobility and aristocracy, a virtuous and educated few elites that would rule wisely. Judges and Supreme Court justices would need to be highly educated and wise, and senators would come from typically upper-class families that could afford to send them to the best schools for higher education and the higher stations in society that allowed for leisure time to explore politics and areas of study that would enable them to become experts in different fields. This is why you see many senators, few and elite, on special Senate committees that have more power than congressional committees. The House of Representatives and all other elections of all other offices nationwide nationwide, local, state, and at the federal level would be polity or timocracy, what people now wrongly call democracy, which is in ideal good form would be a virtuous public majority vote that would place a representative into power with either term limits or successive elected terms. But all these ideal good forms of rule have their evil twins according to Aristotle's work, which would result in the bad forms of rule. 1. A dictator or tyrant. 2. The oligarchy or globalist elite. Or 3. The populist mob. Aristotle observed that it's possible for good, virtuous people to be in power, but it's just harder to see what Aristotle saw in ancient times as virtuous leaders are rare these days because our societies lack real virtue or values. Human nature will sometimes cause people to compromise their morals, ethics, or real virtue, or they are raised in a society that lacks all of those things entirely. Some anti-capitalists, socialists, Marxists, or democratic socialists will claim that we have an oligarchy, and politicians like Bernie Sanders will continually say in their messaging repeatedly that we have to stop the greedy oligarchy.
We live in an oligarchic
But the grassroots
society,
movement and general attitude of the working class have shifted in recent years due to the obvious hypocrisy shown by politicians such as Bernie Sanders. They have largely been losing the support of the working class in recent years. The old order of the democratic machine has seemed to weaken and fall apart as the working class had shifted in recent elections and have not automatically supported Democrats. It is clear that in America we still elect leaders to represent us in Congress, and the billionaires that politicians like Bernie Sanders blames for all of our country's problems and keeps pointing the finger at, they aren't the ones in Congress, nor are they the ones that are elected. To some degree, these politicians are beholden to the people if they want to get re-elected. Granted, many of the billionaires do donate large sums of money to political action committees or super PACs that fund many politicians' campaigns, and so with these political contributions come armies of lobbyists constantly pushing their separate agendas. However, politicians cannot only be beholden to the interests of the lobbyists if they want to keep their office. At some point, they must pass legislation that the people want. That is the genius of term limits for the elected officials. It does hold them accountable to the electorate. These same elected leaders, while not billionaires themselves, they are still multimillionaires, and they became wealthy from their own hypocritical corruption and cronyism within Washington, D.C., as they became career politicians, becoming the very swamp creatures they supposedly railed against. If Bernie Sanders is pointing his finger at billionaires and accusing them of being a part of a corrupt oligarchy, then he's just got three fingers pointing back at himself. It's truly the hypocrisy on full display, a product of those like Bernie Sanders and their idea of democracy. Those on the far left like to overly use the term democracy, but most of them do not truly understand the consequence of a pure democracy. One example that theoretically shows how dangerous the idea of pure democracy is that some Democrats propose the idea of abolishing the Electoral college system in our presidential elections and have the presidential elections based off of the popular vote alone. At first, this sounds like a good idea, but if we examine this idea under a microscope more closely, it presents some unavoidable consequences and problems. If there was no electoral college system, only the states with the biggest populations and biggest cities would really matter in elections. Therefore, candidates would not have to campaign in smaller states, and the voices of smaller parts of America would be ignored. Some people in cities and urban areas might not care about the plight of a farmer or anyone that lives in rural communities, and would be willing to pass laws that put them at a disadvantage because those laws wouldn't affect them negatively in the city. Policy would be made to favor those who live in populous states as opposed to less populous states, and eventually we would effectively have, once again, Aristotle's famous tyranny of the majority. This truth is an inconvenient thorn in the side of leftists and so-called progressives that assume that democracy is always good. Politicians would ignore New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Delaware, Rhode Island, Idaho, Kansas, Oklahoma, and North and South Dakota, small and less populated blue and red states alike, and only campaign and focus on the issues in states like California, New York, Texas, and Florida. They would not need to, nor would be incentivized to run a truly national campaign, and if there was no electoral college, they would only need to win a combination of the big prize states and discard the small states that would no longer matter. Just as a quick example of the massive shift in power this would be, is that one single county in the state of California has a population that is bigger than the population of the entire state of Wyoming. If you get rid of the electoral college and strip Wyoming of the small amount of electoral power that it has, politicians would completely ignore states like Wyoming and only focus on California. People in smaller cities, towns, and communities would lose their voice in the American political system. Some of the left would secretly or even openly now endorse this outcome and cheer it on, and they would have no problem alienating and ignoring half the country they disagree with. Respectively, some of the right would also have no problem getting rid of California, Oregon, and Washington on the left coast, letting them become their own countries and secede from the Union, along with New York and much of New England. This is how divided we are today, where we cease to have discourse and real debate and just resign to the idea that we have to go separate ways. This kind of thinking is the antithesis of anything that resembles the spirit of the United States of America and the concept of a united republic. Some politicians intentionally keep using the term democracy because they know what it really means, and they secretly do want a tyranny of the majority of sorts, but it's packaged as euphemisms like the collective or the working class or the 99%. Although after the 2024 election, for the first time in a long time, the left and the Democrats lost significant support from the working labor class. Even though a majority vote, some on the left wanted to impose their mob rule on the rest of the country, even if they aren't a majority. Communists, socialists, Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, whichever branch of left ideology you want to use, they have rebranded themselves in recent years, and though some now call them neo-Marxists or the new left, they have gone from calling themselves liberals to rebranding themselves progressives to now on the far left, those like Bernie Sanders call themselves democratic socialists. Some of them claim to still want capitalism, but they advocate for more and more financial reform and regulations. However, what that inevitably leads to is often a slippery slope to full-on government and state control of the economy and the means of production, where they eventually take away private ownership. They can keep changing the name and rebranding the same ideology, but the ideas haven't changed much at all. In the extreme leftist worldview, they still largely reject and despise capitalism and Western society in general and want to replace it all with some form of Marxism. People overly use the term democracy, especially Democrats, and in the 2024 election cycle, they, along with the mainstream media, kept saying Trump was a, quote, threat to democracy, unquote.
Donald Trump is an existential threat to our democracy.
And if you think about it, given what democracy actually means, its purest original definition, the one that Aristotle used, it is technically true. Trump and MAGA are a threat to the leftist brand of democracy and their desire for mob rule. Trump and his agenda were indeed a threat to their mob rule, mob mentality, and consensus when Democrats and the administrative state was at the peak of their power, and their monopoly on power and politics, which was their tyranny of the majority. So while the messaging and use of the term democracy by some Democrats and some on the left is disingenuous and perhaps dishonest, the statement Trump is a threat to democracy is actually true if you consider Aristotle's true and original definition of the term democracy. Because here in America, we never have had and we do not have a democracy in the truest sense of the word. word and what it originally meant historically, we have a republic. The leftist mainstream media keeps intentionally phrasing polling questions surrounding the word democracy or repeating phrases like state of our democracy, and the number one voting issue for Democrats in some polling from the 2024 election was the state of democracy, after the barrage of mainstream media narratives and Democrat talking points constantly saying, threat to our democracy. But this way of manipulating language and changing the definition of words is how those who want power are able to control language, definitions, debates, and manipulate academia to their will. In the 2024 election, it turns out that the number one issue for most Americans was not the state of our democracy or any threat to democracy, but for most Americans was either the economy or immigration, and they voted with a mandate to put Trump back in office and to correct course for the nation. Democrats wouldn't even have won had there been no Electoral College because they lost the popular vote for the first time in a very long time, lost the Senate and the House of Representatives in a historic election. The legislative body and the presidency are now firmly in the hands of the Republicans for at least the next year or so, and the majority is now controlled by the GOP as well as the Supreme Court, controlled by mostly conservative justices. And it will remain to be seen if Republicans govern with the best interest of all Americans or if they will eventually become no better than their political rivals and perpetuate their own version of the tyranny of the majority. Neither political party or anyone who is in power is immune to corruption. Plato and Aristotle believed that it was possible and occasionally there could be a philosopher king who would rule justly with virtue and in the best interest and balance of everyone's needs put before their own. Aristotle describes the good form and bad form of three main types of rule: the monarch versus the tyrant, the aristocracy versus the oligarchy, and the polity versus democracy. Aristotle's definition of democracy, which is essentially mob rule, where the majority has tyranny over the minority, what he called the tyranny of the majority, is the definition that we should reclaim moving forward so that the extremists can no longer control political discourse and conversations and refer to our nation as merely a democracy when it is in fact so much more than that with layers of nuance. Many will, despite being told the truth, just automatically think that democracy is inherently good, but the truth is that it isn't at all if you value ancient wisdom. And that's why the founders of the United States Constitution created a system of government that would allow for all the good forms of the three types of government, the checks and balances that would slow down, hopefully prevent, or halt the bad forms from insidiously taking power. And so here we are. Stop saying we are a democracy, because that is a lie. It's time to reclaim the true meaning of the words we use.